Hi, this is Professor McGuire, and welcome to this video lecture focusing on the topic of energy within our larger exploration of environmental law in the United States. By way of introduction and review, the first thing we can say about energy is energy policy. And we should say right at the outset that when we're talking about energy issues in the United States from a legal perspective, we are really talking about a subset of a lot of different actions, regulatory actions, some federal laws, a lot of state and regional planning and agreements, state laws, state agreements between states, cooperation and cooperative actions related to energy. So we're talking about a very disparate area of loosely connected pieces of a mix of formalized policy as law, but a lot of informal policy as well, things that aren't actually put into statutes, but are otherwise agreements, articulation agreements, and a lot of actions by agencies. If we remember our administrative law concepts in the United States, the executive branch of government is given the responsibility to implement the will of government through, or the will of the legislature as a part of government. And that implementation includes executive action. And a lot of that action occurs through the formalized agencies that are created. In the environmental world, one of the largest agencies that we have to deal with environmental issues is the Environmental Protection Agency. It certainly, as an agency, has a role when we talk about energy policy, but it's far from the only agency, major federal executive branch entity that formulates policy related to energy and certainly implementation of laws that have an effect on energy policy. We talked about, for example, the Clean Air Act, and part of the Clean Air Act, which is a federal law to ensure the quality of the air, part of it is to regulate, and part of the way in which it works is it regulates stationary sources. These are energy producers mostly. These are power plants that generate electricity, taking in inputs, whether that power plant is a coal burning power plant or a natural gas burning power plant or a hydroelectric dam power plant or a nuclear power plant that uses nuclear energy. They can have different types of inputs. But depending on those inputs and depending on the process, for example, coal, when you're burning coal, you have emissions. You have emissions of things that are problematic for human health. We talked about sulfur as one example. We have coal in the United States that's high sulfur in certain parts of the country, mostly in the eastern United States, and we have lower sulfur content in the western United States. But sulfur in and of itself, as a byproduct of the burning of the coal to try to generate electricity, that sulfur is problematic when it goes into the air. So we have, under the Clean Air Act, very specific restrictions on how much you can dirty that air. We talked about NAAQS, National Ambient Air Quality Standards, and to identify air sheds in certain parts of the country. This is, again, under the Clean Air Act, and how in order to meet those standards, often these places like these power plants, they are mandated under the Clean Air Act to use best available technology. And often that refers to these filters, these scrubbers, these large scale filters that exist that after you burn the coal, before the soot is released into the atmosphere through smokestacks, there's a technology that's put in place to absorb and take out of the soot a lot of the things that can have negative consequences for human well-being and other environmental considerations, but mostly centered on human health and well-being, which can be a proxy for environmental health. Sometimes, what's good for humans is often good for the environment. What's bad for humans is often bad for the environment. So, but we talked about that. So there's an example there where the Clean Air Act affects energy policy in some ways because it makes the production of energy in some ways more expensive when you're using coal as an input, but it influences and affects energy production. And then the Environmental Protection Agency has authority to implement those portions of the Clean Air Act and has authority to enforce. And so to ensure that these power plants are complying with that aspect of the Clean Air Act. So they have effectively jurisdiction over parts of energy production in that way in the United States. But certainly The federal FERC is another agency. There's the Energy Regulatory Commission, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, and that agency is primarily has a lot more influence over the development of large-scale industrial and commercial energy concerns. These the siting of power plants, the commissioning of power plants, the regulating of those power plants. The certification of them, so FERC is more of a sort of a planning. Think of the entity that's involved in ensuring that these power plants are, sited in the proper area, that they're safe, that they're built to certain standards, they develop those standards, and that's under a whole different set of laws. But that's an entirely different federal agency that's involved in energy. What I'm trying to suggest here is, and that's just at the federal level, by the way, there's all kinds of additional state level requirements and even local requirements that are involved, and also regional between multiple states. So energy is really, it's hard to see it just from a legal standpoint, because there's just so many different aspects, so many different laws that share some space in the energy field. If we thought of a Venn diagram, we'd see that all of these different laws, to one degree or another, they share some space. They might not be involved with energy and regulating energy per se, but they have an effect. I think the Clean Air Act is probably one example of that. There's others. But so it's very complicated and convoluted. So unlike other environmental laws that we've looked at up to now, like controlling pollution or land use, things like that, when we talk about energy, it's really more of a policy, an overarching sort of policy. It's easier to discuss sort of the environmental issues from a policy perspective in many ways than it is to talk about it from an environmental law perspective, because there's too much minutia, there's too much detail that we'd have to get into to try to understand all of the sort of nuance that applies. So this video and discussion is really talking about the overarching federal level sort of policies and initiatives that influence energy from an environmental perspective in the United States. It will identify a couple of laws, and a couple, mostly from more of the policy than the legal detail perspective, but it's really meant to talk about it from a policy standpoint. So from that perspective, the first thing we can say is that energy policy is really about converting sources of energy from one form to another. The law of thermodynamics, if you remember, one of the fundamental laws, right, is energy is neither created nor destroyed. It simply changes forms. And that has some influence and some say over our idea of the Earth system being at equilibrium and to some degree being a closed system. The notion there is that we're not taking something and making something new out of nothing. We're simply doing another set of reformulations. We talked a little bit about reformulations in the most previous lecture on waste. We talked about that waste is really about taking, right, molecules and elements that already exist and then, putting them into some other form and then using them for some purpose, and then deciding that whatever that purpose, it's been met and we no longer desire the continued use of the of the product, of the energy, if you want to say, because it takes input, but of that product. So if we think about it from a physics or from a chemical standpoint, we no longer have use for that product or energy at that point, and therefore we redefine it from being something we want to something we don't want, aka waste. It's very much a normative term. So energy is very much like that as well, in the sense that what we're talking about is we're just taking, we're doing conversions. We're taking something that has potential energy and we're trying to utilize that potential energy, that stored energy that exists in something, and turn it into energy that we want to use, transform it into a type of energy, usually electricity, that we can then use for some human purpose. The question for policy/law is thinking about the relative benefits and costs of different inputs into creating energy. So maybe one of the best ways of thinking about this, about energy policy, energy laws in the United States, is really thinking about, how we define, like we can make, if our goal is electricity, if we say energy is really about producing electricity, it's not just that, producing heat, there are many different ways in which, we can think about energy, for example, but let's just focus on electricity. There are many different ways that we can make electricity, that we can take potential energy and then transform it into, something that we want to use. And we can do it from very difficult ways. We can If you think about coal, for example, we can go and we can mine coal, right? We can build a facility that is capable of burning coal and using that coal. But then we have to go and find the coal. And there's all entire processes in doing that. We go into the natural world, we dig down, sometimes there's mountaintop removal, there's different methods. We can dig a hole in the ground to find seams of coal. We can locate seams of coal without digging holes with new technology in mountain areas. And then we can simply blow up the mountain to make it safer for individuals so that they don't have to go into dangerous caves, individual humans, but of course at the expense of that local ecosystem by literally blowing up the mountain and sort of excavating the coal from the rubble as we do it. Are many different ways we can extract the coal. And then there's a problem with the form of extraction, the process of extraction, black lung, the exposure, not just the dangers to the individuals in extracting the coal, but then in getting the coal into a usable form and moving it into a place. And of course, we talked about sulfur, for example, and the externalities with sulfur. But even then, getting the coal, sending it to a power plant, the power plant then using that coal, effectively putting it into, lighting it on fire, putting it into a large drum, lighting it on fire, and then using the heat that's generated from the coal, the fire, to heat water and create steam. And then using that steam to then, turn a turbine, basically the steam to create pressure to turn a turbine. And then that turbine creates, as a result of its turning, that sort of energy, it creates electricity. And then that electricity is really the thing that we then send away using power lines and then send off to be used and utilized. So there's one example. There's a lot going on there. There's energy losses at every stage. We'll talk a little bit about that. We'll quickly summarize what that means. So it's not exactly the most efficient form of taking energy from one source. Byproducts include, like I said, sulfur. There's others. There's particulate matter. There's a real problem. Particulate matter has been shown to have real problems, not just respiratory physical problems, but also neurological issues. And that's more recent research, but there's all kinds of issues and there's all kinds of additional costs. It just depends on how we define these things. When we're talking about benefits and costs, what our criteria are and what our variables are and how we define them, and whether we define them as something we're willing to internalize as a cost, or if we're saying, well, there's no market for it and we don't pay money for it and we can externalize it, then therefore we don't consider it a cost. There's all kinds of arguments about that, but just understanding that's a very sort of convoluted process which has many steps and potential problems, and for sure isn't even the most efficient form of utilizing energy. We can juxtapose that example. For example, coal, using coal as the input to solar panels, using the sunlight as the input. We could also do wind, but the idea is that we have to manufacture these solar cells, and there's a process for doing that, and it's relatively safe, and it requires some rare earth elements and some other things, but once it's done, once we've produced it, and of course that technology is changing and advancing, the components that are required to create solar panels, the process of creating solar panels, the resiliency of those panels, the light, the shelf life of those panels, the usable life of those panels, all of that is getting better and better as we invest in more and more technological innovation and research in this area. We have solar panels now that can work in just any ambient light. We even have solar panels now that can use temperature differentials in the evening between warm and cold, which happens when you have colder air coming in as the sun goes down, and can still create energy using a temperature differential in the evening, so they don't even need sunlight. So we're moving in all kinds of interesting directions in utilizing and extracting as much potential value of energy creation. But once those panels are created, the idea is that they're placed in an area where they can receive either direct or indirect sunlight, and then it's just a passive process. That sunlight is just coming in. It's coming in anyway. There's nothing that has to be done. There's no special digging. There's no special finding the sun. It's just there. And then it simply, excites electrons within the cells, the photovoltaic cells, and those electrons, as they get excited, they move along a current, and that creates electricity. That's the process, and it's a much more efficient process overall per unit of energy, especially considering there's not a lot of work involved in getting the sun. Once those solar panels are up, the sun just comes, and it's going to come anyway. So there's not a lot of cost involved in utilizing and capturing that sun once you have those panels put in place. So we can juxtapose those two ways, and we can have a long discussion about what are the relative costs and benefits and so on and so forth. And we know just from direct market forces, without including any of those other additional costs, that, solar now is cheaper. It's cheaper, and it's always been cheaper if we consider all the costs associated, carbon, sulfur, et cetera, with coal. But now it is cheaper just on a sort of a very fundamental direct cost, direct value, or direct benefits, dollar for dollar comparison. And same thing with wind. Wind is becoming much cheaper as well. Once you've developed the wind towers, there's some other issues with winds, with wind energy development and so on and so forth. But anyway, we can use these as examples to try to understand this question that we're talking about here. It's really thinking about relative benefits and costs of different inputs. And that's what we mean by inputs. What are we using to create the electricity? And so we can think about that. And then, of course, the criteria for how we're defining that benefit cost analysis is really important. And then we can say, are some, for example, within this larger question, are some inputs more efficient than others? Do they yield a higher net energy transfers? So we can just look at that efficiency question I just summarized. Is it just, are you getting more unit value? And then is that scalable? The one thing that, is that you can burn a lot of coal and you can generate a lot of electricity in those plants without having to have a larger footprint. Of course, you need larger solar installations in order to create. You can create per unit more efficient solar production. As I was talking about, you can have them work more efficiently per unit area, generate more electricity per unit area. But generally speaking, if you're going to, outside of some of those gains that we're having in technology innovations in solar production of electricity, otherwise you need a larger footprint. You need to create more footprint in order to generate more electricity. So we can talk about those in terms of efficiency. And do some inputs have other costs, these externalities? And of course they do. I just gave you an example with coal. There's a number of externalities. There's also externalities. There's no such thing as a free lunch. That's one of the sort of fundamental truths or posits that exist in our beliefs in economics, for example. But that nothing is completely free. There are always trade-offs. And so, of course, all inputs have other costs, but what are those other costs and what secondary effects do they have? What secondary effects do they have on the environment, on human health and well-being, that kind of thing? So we can always consider that as well when we talk about our benefit cost analysis. So, for example, carbon release. Anything that releases carbon and adds net carbon to the atmosphere is problematic and vis-a-vis the climate, creates a heating effect, and we're seeing this play out. It's no longer really, we're just sort of real-time experiencing these higher intensity and frequency of storms, and the costs, those direct costs that are associated with them, they're significant. So we can think about those in terms of externalities and the secondary effects, because not only are they problematic in terms of the cost associated with the types of events where you have more, dry conditions and then extremely wet conditions, or you have higher intensity storms and they create a lot of damage. But of course, the point is they do create a lot of damage. They make things more difficult for people. And certainly in the United States, we've seen areas where we've had, more significant storms. There are other areas of the world that are getting much drier, and that's creating huge human suffering in terms of their ability to feed, nations and portions of nations being able to feed themselves. And effectively, have the type of lifestyle and, what they've been doing for literally hundreds, if not thousands of years. And it's fundamentally changing. And so you can think about those as secondary effects. I mentioned sulfur emissions. There's a pure example of secondary effects that we've acknowledged from burning coal, and the need to either create technology to limit the amount of sulfur, right, that comes out, or to move to other inputs, whether that's low coal sulfur or just removing coal from the equation when it comes to energy generation, creating energy, because we have alternatives. We have other options as our inputs for creating energy. And then there's the evaluating energy policy holistically. So when we think about energy policy, we have all of these questions and sub-questions and considerations. But ultimately, what we're saying is that evaluating energy policy holistically can help us better understand existing laws and new policy directions. So we can look at what we do now, what we've done historically, what we have available to us now, and then that can help us think more holistically about where we might head in the future. Maybe we should be maybe we're moving in the right direction. Maybe the, lessening our dependence on certain types of inputs makes a lot of sense, and really heightening and expanding our reliance on other inputs might make a lot of sense, but it gives us a sense of maybe where we're heading in the future, or where we should head. And so that can help us not only forecast what might happen in the future, but for those that are interested in creating new policy, new law, legitimizing policy, they can really be focused on making this happen and advocating for this as a reasonable objective and natural consequence. And all of us need to understand that, by the way, is not necessarily coal, certainly not natural gas, but oil is a global market, for example. So, there are other factors involved, and we've seen this historically where we've been dependent on other state actors, other nations, and what they do and don't do, and it's affected our capacity to provide energy security. That's being seen in Europe with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, for example. That creates and has created an issue for a lot of Europe that was highly dependent on Russian natural gas and oil, where that dependency has created a security issue for those nations, Germany, many of the Western European nations, in terms of just their ability to not only keep themselves warm, but also to provide the energy inputs for manufacturing, industrial, etc. When you move to, you can imagine, for example, if you had most of your energy provided by renewables, if you had a significant wind infrastructure and you had solar infrastructure and these were already in operation, then the inputs are there. The inputs are local. We have to understand that, right? And you're getting the sun that's local to you. You're getting the wind that's local to you. So you don't have to worry about paying for or being subject to other actors. And so that's another consideration in terms of when we think about, not only in terms of policy directions for a variety of reasons, if we think about it from a security perspective. And of course, climate change and security should be hand in hand. This is not a controversial thing to think about. Whenever we can see there's a risk, and that risk is something where we have control to some degree over portions of that risk and how we engage that risk, whether we minimize that risk, I mean, that's effectively security. That's what we're talking about. So anyway, there are other considerations that, and both the United States and other countries can think of from a national security perspective. So just to start off, to get our understanding and overview here in terms of energy, generally speaking, I mentioned coal as an example, and I mentioned that, there's a whole process where potential energy that's in the coal is stored, and then we want to extract that coal, and then we want to use it. And through using it, we have a process of generating electricity. And one of the things that happens there is that that coal has an X amount of unit of energy potential. There's energy stored in that coal, mostly through burning the coal in terms of its capacity to burn and then release energy in the process of that chemical reaction of ignition and of burning. And so at that process, there's the burning of the coal. The problem here is what we're talking about is that we have multiple steps. We have it's three sort of steps at least in terms of generating electricity, where at every step when we burn the coal, we lose energy, right? Because there's a lot of that given off as heat, and you can imagine. So giving off a heat that doesn't do much to make the steam. Some of the heat is transferred into the water to create steam to heat up the water, but a lot of that heat is just given off in the process. And then, of course, we know that the steam itself is giving off a lot of energy, as some of it is being used to move the turbine, but a lot of it is just being given off as it hits the air and cools. So there's also energy loss there. And just the point here is that we're losing energy. And then moving the turbine, the process of moving the turbine itself, there's even energy loss, where the turbine is creating electricity, but a lot of that energy in moving the turbine isn't meant to create it. It's not a direct transfer of all the energy that moves the turbine is now energy equals 1-to-1 energy that is now an output as electricity. There's a lot of energy loss there too. So you have to burn. The point is, in order to get some amount of electricity, you have to burn a lot more coal, a lot more energy of coal to get that smaller amount of electricity. And that's something that is just true. That's a simple fact in the process. The fact that we just we don't use coal for almost any other purpose means that, and it's readily available, generally speaking. If we only stick to direct costs, it's relatively cheap. Then, coal historically has been a readily available. It's there. The United States has lots of it. Many countries have a lot of it. It's local, it's domestic, so you don't have to worry about that state actor issue where you have to get it from somebody else. It's easy to transport once you have it, relatively speaking, easy to transport, put it on trains, that sort of thing. It's not extremely heavy. You get it to its destination, and even with all of those losses, it provides a good amount of energy relative to its size and its weight and that sort of thing. So coal's always been historically a pretty good deal. But the point is, we just lose a lot of energy. There's a lot of energy transfer in the process. And all that carbon that's given off, et cetera, those are all byproducts of that process: sulfur, carbon, particulates, other things. As far as a carbon release feedback, we can again look at coal as our example, and we can see here's our feedback loop. We talked about this in waste. We brought it forward in waste, and when we also talked about it in Introduction to Environmental Law as an overview of environmental issues. We can see coal as an input here on the left. And then in our sort of our unit here, right, our system unit, we can see the burning of fossil fuel releases carbon into the atmosphere. Right. And so we have carbon as one of the outputs. There's others, but we're just focusing on carbon. Right. And then, of course, the feedback of that, of increasing the amount of carbon in the atmosphere, is that we have the greenhouse effect. We have climate change as sort of a feedback loop. And then there's all of the consequences of that. And there are many, many consequences, not just the consequences that we deal with today, but climate change is one of those funny things where each of those units of carbon, they aggregate over time, and they have a long-term, 100+ years, hundreds of years of residence time of additional carbon in the atmosphere that doesn't just quickly move out unless we figure out a way to do that. And that's another question about, in terms of actually carbon removal, but that's a different question, actually sucking that carbon out of the atmosphere. But anyway, in the process of carbon sequestration, from the atmosphere, all things being equal right now, is we're just moving carbon into the atmosphere, and then we're creating a greenhouse effect, which then has all of these implications. So we can see that from a carbon release feedback sort of model. And that then feeds into our thought process, and it should, from a policy standpoint, about whether or not carbon intensive practices of generating electricity make sense when we have alternatives. Of course, we've been doing carbon, we've been doing coal and oil and natural gas for many, many decades. And the question, and we've gotten good at that, and we've developed a large scale. We've done it at scale. We can do it at times when it's cloudy. We can do it in the nighttime. We can burn that stuff at any time we need it. So there's all kinds of sort of current benefits through a habituation or path dependency, right? We've become habituated to doing it this way. We know how to do it this way. We're good at doing it this way. And it creates a lot of stability. But as we're increasing our alternative energy methods and means, and that includes nuclear, but nuclear has had its own sort of speed bumps along the way, more political than actual, but nuclear is certainly carbon-free. When we start thinking of the cost of carbon, maybe nuclear makes more sense, expanding nuclear, but that's a very difficult proposition because of a number of hurdles, again, mostly political, borne out in terms of cost, in terms of regulatory hurdles, but that's another conversation. But certainly non-carbon methods, and let's just focus on, and nuclear should, putting nuclear aside and other renewables, the current renewables we're thinking about, which is mostly, there's some geothermal, but let's just, solar and wind are the two large ones that we can think of. Hydro is certainly another, but there's solar and wind for the moment as other methods. They don't contain any of this sort of problematic sort of approach. They have their other issues, but they don't contain the carbon issue, which is a large scale aggregate issue, something that aggregates over time and then stays with us for a very long period of time. In terms of energy, it's important to remember when we think about energy policy, we're bringing forward here our friend that we've used a variety of times here, our conceptual sort of diagram here, to help us understand that the environment creates the outer constraints. We had this in our Introduction to Environmental Issues as the overview of environmental law, in our 3 overview video lectures. But we can say here, we brought this forward in some of the other applications, that remember that our economic decisions are constrained by our social, decisions and social institutions, but all of human interaction, if human interaction equals, this plus this, all of that is constrained by our environmental considerations. We can expand that. We can, like I said, we can figure out technological solutions. For example, we keep, changing and altering our behavior patterns. We can keep pushing carbon into the air, and as it gets worse and worse in terms of the conditions, we can then spend time and energy and money figuring out how to sort of suck carbon out of the atmosphere, actively remove carbon from the atmosphere, and that's without changing our other behaviors. In other words, adding a new behavior to mitigate the effects of previous behaviors, or to counteract the effects of previous behaviors. You can see tweaking the system there. It gets a bit complicated. And that then does change those environmental constraints. It doesn't change the environmental constraint. So if we look at the environmental constraint as a principle, as a foundational principle of, the environmental conditions should be relatively equivalent to that steady state that we talked about. Human development has occurred over the last 10,000 years under a relatively stable climate and environment. Human civilization has moved from hunter-gathering, from basic, right, to proto-city states, to city states, to what we have today, to a globalized economy with lots of people living in very small spaces where we rely on trade, whether that's, national trade or global trade, right? We're relying on the ability of moving things and the ability of producing things and the ability of natural cycles to be consistent, growing seasons to be consistent between years, between decades. We've relied on all of these different things, this stable background environmental conditions, this steady state, in order to move from, basically hunter-gatherers, very few humans coalescing together, to large cities and mega cities that we have today in the population, the 7+ billion people. That's how it's happened. It's happened under that stability. So when we talk about the environment, we're talking about that sort of generalized stability, that stable environment, those stable background conditions. And so what we say here is that all of our actions are in principle, related. Can we change and manipulate? Sure. Can we add carbon to the atmosphere? Yes, we've done that. We are doing that. Is that affecting these background environmental conditions? Excuse me. Yes, it's absolutely affecting these background environmental conditions. Is it doing it in a way that might lead to a change, that threshold response we showed in that graph in our previous lectures? Can it move us to a new equilibrium state that's less conducive to human well-being, less conducive to those back? Yes, we can. But can we then manipulate? Can we start sucking carbon out of the air in order to try to ensure that we don't move beyond that threshold state? Can we move back to the initial equilibrium? It's entirely possible. The question we have to ask ourselves is, how many things do we control? How many variables are we controlling? Are we controlling, because remember, cause and effect is a funny thing. We don't know. We don't know if we can we certainly know we can add carbon to the atmosphere. We're doing that. We've been doing it now for decades. The question we haven't answered is, can we manage that in a way that doesn't cause other problems? Are we aware of all of the variables? Can we master all of the variables? What is the cost of doing this? So these are the difficulties. We've done this where we've had purposeful introduction of species. We want to control a pest species that's affecting crops. So we introduce from another country, another region of the world, a species to control the pest. And then, of course, our belief was it would do its job and it wouldn't have any effect on the ecosystem. And we can see that's run amok in many instances where, oh no, our assumptions about how we could control this other species were wrong. And the species is capable of doing things that we never expected it to do. We never thought it could do. And so the point is, nature is dynamic and our ability to control all of the aspects of it is precarious. And there's something called the precautionary approach. It's one of the ways in which we might think about how we develop policy related to environmental issues. And that is, we should be more humble. We should assume that we don't know everything or that we can't control everything. And that's what it means to be precautionary. So if we can allow for natural conditions to just maintain the status quo, that should be our goal. And so that's one of the ways of thinking about this environment. But vis-a-vis energy, certainly we're talking about manipulations of current energy flows, right? We're taking something that is in a stored state, whether it's coal, et cetera, right? And we're utilizing it. Some of the renewables, particularly wind and solar, once we've created the receptacles, whether it's the wind turbine or the solar panel, the thing that will capture and then transform, right, the input. Once we've created those, then everything is just natural, meaning that there's no manipulation of the background environment. They stay solely within background environmental conditions because the sun is the sun, right? It's shining on us and it continues. It's necessary for life and our existence. If the sun goes out, which apparently it will do in billions of years, then this existence as we know it is over. So the sun is incredibly important for our survival, and it just naturally comes in. Sunlight, that heat, that type of on the electromagnetic spectrum, that type of energy is very important. The sort of heat signature energy. is incredibly important for us for our own well-being and survival. So sunlight's really important. Wind, same thing. Wind is just the differentiation between temperatures, whether that's water temperatures and certainly air temperatures, right? It moves that differential between warm and cold, makes things move. There's a little bit of, rotation of the earth and other movements and tides, but mostly it's really, so gravity has an influence, of course, but when we have those temperature differentials, we have wind. And so wind is natural and it varies, but, overall, there are places where wind is happening a lot. And so we can utilize that. But the point is, once we've done that, we are truly within those background environmental conditions. So I hope you understand what that concept means. And that's what it means here vis-a-vis energy. So one of the few things we can say about this in terms of an overview is that the current society, our current society globally, is technologically advanced and advancing. So that's been our thing, certainly since the Industrial Revolution in the mid-1800s, let's say. And this is globally, right? Now, it happened in certain regions of the globe at that time, and there's been sort of, it's not been proportional and equal in terms of the advancement, but we certainly are now a globalized society where, where we're learning new things and new applications of things. And it's not exponential, but it's pretty close. It just depends on what, what you're putting on the graph and what the variable is. But we are advancing, and our advancing continues, right? And we call it advancing, but we're learning new and different ways of doing things. And those new and different ways of doing things are affecting our choices. And that's what I mean by advancement. And then we're making new choices. We're implementing these other different ways. We're doing the same old things, relatively speaking, whether we think of transportation, for example. It's just how we're transporting ourselves and the distances we're transporting ourselves and the time it takes to move those distances, and who is transporting themselves and how many people and how far are they going. So that, humans moving from A to B has been happening since humans existed in any form. And so that's not different, but how we're doing it is changing. And that's what we mean by advancement or technological advancement. And that's what I mean in this context. So that's happening. That's a truth. And then so energy, what we can understand is that energy is a basic need and driver of that advancement, that technological awareness and the continued advancement. And, there's been sort of, we call it the Holy Grail, or, the goal, the ultimate goal has been to drive energy cost towards zero. If you had almost zero cost for energy inputs, so energy is the means by which we do so much of what we do, by which what I'm doing now, by which how you're viewing this video, right? It all takes energy. Energy is the foundation of almost everything we do. It is so important. So imagine, because it's so necessary and so important, it has a cost, certainly. And there's, of course, a marketplace for it in order to produce the energy, create incentives. We have here in the United States and many other, but some might consider it a public good, but certainly in a marketplace, then to incentivize the development of that energy, again, outside of it being a public good, because it is a public good, because it's so foundational, I think, to almost all human existence. At least a technologically advanced version of human existence. It's fundamental. But, so to create incentives, you have to have, market forces at play. So you have cost, and then that cost is passed on. In other words, we pay utility bills, et cetera, right? And that's based on relative costs of doing things and maybe some other considerations and so on and so forth. But the point is, if you can imagine energy, the cost of it going almost to zero, where we could produce it. This is where it's sort of like a nuclear fusion, right? Is that nuclear fusion? Yes. Yes, where you're not breaking apart the elemental particles of nuclear, which is we do fission in our nuclear, but fusion, where effectively you can then start a process. You take X amount of energy to begin a nuclear fusion process. This is like how the sun operates, basically taking hydrogen molecules and under intense pressure, being able to fuse them together, right, to create, helium, right, the second molecule. So taking two elements to create a new element effectively. And in the process, releasing a lot of energy. And in fusion, what ends up happening is that you have a unit of energy of input to create the reaction. But once that happens, the reaction replicates itself and it gives off more energy than what's required to produce the reaction. And then it just continues in a cycle. And so what happens is that it self-replicates effectively. And in that process, it always produces more energy than what is necessary to continue or start the reaction. So it is effectively limitless energy, net limitless energy. So if you could solve the problem. And it looks like at experimental levels, we're figuring out how to do that. But if you could effectively replicate the sun here in small units and in a safe way, you would be able to produce energy almost costless. Once you've spent for the cost of the initial startup, the actual production of new energy would exceed any input. So instead of it being coal, where you're just getting a minuscule portion, right, of the energy in the coal, the unit of coal from the beginning, you're getting it as just a small portion of that through a lot of work at the end to turn into electricity. This would be the opposite, where you take a relatively speaking small unit of energy. It's quite a bit at what we know now to start up the process, but take just a small unit of energy, you could create effectively an infinite amount of energy from that. So it goes in the opposite direction. And that means effectively driving the cost of energy to zero. But the point is, that would be the sort of the ideal situation where we would all have easy, unlimited access to energy to solve our basic human needs, and we would pay almost nothing for it. There would be almost no cost for society in general, and certainly for individuals within that society. It truly would be a public good, and it would be a public good like gravity might be a public good. We don't think about gravity because it's costless for us, right? It's a pre-existing background condition. It's incredibly important for our survival. Boy, we need it, because otherwise we would be a mess, wouldn't be able to survive. Think of it like that. Think of something that's, wow, and my use of the gravity does nothing to diminish the availability of the gravity to you. It's not divisible in that way, where I can take units of it and therefore there's nothing left for you. Imagine unbounded, unlimited energy just available, readily available like that. And it's just something that is a background condition to our living, our basic living. But anyway, so energy is a basic need and driver of our economy. And it seems like that's going to be the case forever. As long as humans now, whatever we will do from now on, whether we continue to evolve, if that's what we're calling it, or advance in this way, this descriptive operational use of the term advance, because others will see it as not an advancement, but as, having its own problems, but let's call it advancement in the way that I'm trying to explain it. But as we continue to do this and find out new and different ways of doing things, and then experimenting with those new and different ways of doing things, we need energy, and it's likely we'll continue to need energy in the future in the very same way. One of the things we can say outside of that idealized situation of nuclear fusion, we can say that cost matters, that cheap energy, right? That, what we look for today is that we want to find the cheapest versions of energy. So again, cheap is a relative term, right? So we've already talked about this idea of total use value. We brought it up previously. It's been in our introductory materials, certainly, and I've talked about it in the context of pollution, mostly in pollution. So you can look at those videos as well, for those of you that haven't seen this, but also in the overview materials. But total use value is direct use versus plus indirect plus non-use values. Most of the time when we're using this equation, we only talk about this when we're talking about cost. So cheap energy is really about, whoa, how much does it cost to get the coal from the coal from the ground and put it and burn it and get electricity out of it. We don't include many of the indirect use values, many of the costs associated with those values, which is the ecosystem values, the human health issues, that sort of thing. And then of course the non-use values like mountaintop removal, just aesthetically, it's in most cases just a mess. And also the slurry and some of the other things that affect the watersheds. These are problematic, but when we don't include these things, these are mainly the environmental considerations. We only think of usually, well, just in isolation with blinders, what's the cost of extracting out of the ground, getting it on simply processing it, putting it on a train or on a boat, and then moving it to the facility to burn, moving it to the energy generation, the power plant to burn. That's usually what we think about, but cost matters. And so usually if we only consider that, then we allow things to be competitive that have other issues, carbon, sulfur, etc. So environmental health constraints our social and economic capacity. What I was trying to talk about at the beginning is that this environmental well-being is really a constraint. It's the outer constraint on our social and economic capacity, on the choices we can make. So we don't want to make choices where we degrade this, because if we degrade this to a point where it fundamentally moves beyond our background conditions and expectations, all of a sudden we can't grow the things we want to grow. We don't have the, nature's not helping us in the way that it normally helps us. And those costs just start increasing to the point where it starts breaking down our social fabric, reduces our social capacity, which certainly it reduces our economic capacity. And then you can have, the fall of our civilization is entirely plausible. So you could see how that happens. So, but environmental health constraints and environmental health in general constrains our social and economic capacity. So agreeing to assumptions, then policy might push towards renewable sources of energy. What I'm saying here is that when you add all of these things up, and we know what we know today with also the sort of precautionary sort of overlay of, geez, we know that if we try to manipulate too many things in the environment, we know often we make mistakes, that we don't know everything. So, we worry about carbon because we know carbon additions into the atmosphere certainly are causing climate change. We know this, it's an objective fact, and it's problematic for human well-being and not only the future, but today. It's already having a significant impact on our well-being today. So knowing that we don't want to, that the environment constrains and affects our social, societal capacity, our economic capacity, then all of those things from a policy standpoint might tell us that generally speaking, we want to move more towards, renewable forms of energy. Because in many ways, we're talking about less secondary impacts, less carbon, less sulfur, less, things that affect. And even from a security standpoint, it's very difficult when you're subject to the political ideations of other nations for your basic energy needs. And the reason that's difficult is because energy is not a choice. It's not something that's a preference, I should say, right? It's an absolute need. It's a necessity. It is foundational to our society. So it's not something you could then leave up to, well, if we don't have it, we're fine because we don't really need it. It's an aesthetic thing. It's something that, I might need a car, but I don't need a Lamborghini, right? It's not a preference. It's a matter of, no, this is an absolute necessity. Without it, it is fundamental to human well-being in almost every society, effectively every society today, at least in terms of the major societies. As far as U.S. energy policy, now that's policy in general, but looking at U.S. energy policy more specifically. Historically, we've had a coevolution between energy need and technological growth. And so, what we mean there is that as we found new ways and cheaper ways and more sort of readily available ways of creating energy, and mostly through electrification or whatever, but, energy inputs, whether it's to heat things into, for manufacturing, industrial, think of the early industrial revolution, right? There's been this sort of coevolution between energy need and technological growth. So as our energy needs have increased and our technological growth has also lockstep increased. And we can see a historical evolution. We had coal. Coal's great. It's, like I said, readily available. It's easily to manipulate in terms of starting off. But then, over time, you have to put a lot of coal. Think of the Titanic, if everybody remembers the movie as an example, those guys downstairs just shoveling all day. Or you think of the old locomotives shoveling those large piles of coal into those burners in order to generate steam to make the engines go. It just takes up a lot of space. Oil per unit, right? It was liquid. You didn't need as much of it. It wasn't as heavy necessarily. So oil was an advancement over coal in many ways in terms of energy output as well. The burning of oil, how much you needed to burn per energy, wasn't as readily available as coal necessarily, a little harder to get, but it was more efficient, particularly for steam, for ships. So you think of, and they could move faster, the engine, they could drive the engines faster, burn at a more sort of efficient rate. And then, of course, more nuclear, hydro, solar, and wind. But as we see this advancement, the point I'm trying to make here is that we see this advancement also happen with technological growth. As our capacity, so we have this sort of hand in hand, where as our energy needs have, increased and our ability to provide for those needs has also been satiated, we've had technological increases in growth commensurate. And many of our policies have been influenced by that availability in history. I called it, sort of a path dependency, right? A habituation, right? Get into a sort of a habit, a way of doing things, and it works, and it's relatively available, and it's easy because we understand it, and it has a history, and that history gives us some sense of assurance. It's like, well, I trust it. I know it works because it has been working. So many of our policies, believe it or not, we're just human beings, are influenced by that availability in history. In Maine, they have an old saying there. It's a colloquialism that if it ain't broke, don't fix it. So the idea here is that that's very much of, hey, we figured out a way of doing something. It seems to work. It might not be, the best way or maybe the future way. That there are other ways that we possibly could try, but we don't know those ways. We haven't tried those ways, and so it's stable. It's something that we can trust, and therefore we tend to rely on it. And many of our policies are influenced by that. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. A large supply of relatively easily accessible coal domestically has been historically one of the reasons that coal has been such a large influence. China is developing a lot of power plants, even still today, that are based on coal, even knowing the effects that it has, the air quality issues. India, same thing. And they're dealing with significant air quality issues, and they're also dealing with the problems of climate change. And they know this and they understand this, but it's just, it's an incredibly, they know that they have a huge need. They have a huge population that's moving from rural conditions to moving to more, sort of an advanced economy. Their economies are advancing very quickly, relatively speaking. And as a result of that, they need the energy, because remember, technological growth, it's sort of lockstep with energy needs. We see this sort of lockstep. They go hand in hand. So there's a need, and that need can't be fulfilled fully through renewable energies, or at least it's just because we're still in the sort of renewable energies are more of the avant-garde, and it's sort of nascent, relatively speaking, in comparison, and they're still advancing and changing. So, there's a difficulty in trying to just move in one direction. So they're using the sort of, this is what energy is. It's sort of a scatter plot policy where it's like, well, let's just try a bunch of different things, including things that we know are problematic, but, will help us bridge the gap, is the sort of term. We'll bridge the gap to that future where we don't need carbon intensive forms of energy production. But that large supply of relatively easily accessible coal is so sort of, because again, it's domestic, it can be domestically satisfied, so on and so forth. And it has a low direct cost, think of our total value, right? But large indirect costs, we know this. Historically, at least in the United States, the OPEC oil embargo of the 1970s, right? That was a real thing. That was a real thing that just created a huge energy crunch, particularly with oil, right? So these are the OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum, oh geez, I'm not remembering the acronym now, but it's it's a number of nations. It's the some of the Arab nations led by Saudi Arabia, but others, and certainly Venezuela. A lot of the larger petroleum producing nations decided to get together and become a bloc and then make decisions, and they still do today on because oil is traded on a global market, so the price of oil is based on supply demand as a global market, and so they can have a huge influence on oil prices, and that has a huge impact on the economy, particularly when oil is used as an important input, things like refinement for gasoline, kerosene, so jet fuel, automobile fuel, right, internal combustion engines, has a huge impact because so much of our society is based on energy, and that's transportation, moving, right? So these are things that move. And so we talked about electrification, but oil is really, really important in all of those. And then there's a huge industry. We talked about plastics, et cetera, but oil, hydrocarbons are fundamental in developing so many different things. It's an input for so many different things, not just energy, but also products. So that OPEC oil embargo, when they did that, it had a huge shock, and we were dealing with other economic issues domestically, but it really exacerbated inflation and made things really difficult. We had something called stagflation, where we had a really problematic time in the mid to late 1970s into the early 1980s, where the United States was suffering from a lack of energy, long lines waiting for gasoline, because gasoline became so sort of scarce. There was just not enough supply to satiate demand. And that's what we talk about when we say that there's this sort of dependence on state actors elsewhere makes things difficult. And if energy is fundamental to the well-being of a society, then any of those types of actions, right? You don't want to have something that is so fundamental. It's like having your healthcare, I don't know, maybe, your healthcare system entirely dependent on a third-party state actor from a different country. And so whether or not hospitals are going to be built, whether or not there's availability of doctors, all of that is dependent on somebody else's choices. And you think, wow, that can't be, right? That can't be, because it's so fundamental to basic human well-being and, national well-being. It's almost a national security concern. So that's U.S. energy policy has been influenced by the oil embargo in the 1970s. And the question is, one of the things that we have had to deal with since then is, how do we want to increase our domestic extraction or develop alternatives for energy? So this is one way of dealing with that problem, and is saying, let's go more domestic. Since we have external issues, let's make more domestic solutions. And so we can increase the development of oil production in the United States. It's a big country, a lot of oil, both terrestrially and also offshore, both that has been identified and still some to be identified. And so do we just increase that, Fracking is one technology over the past couple of decades that has really come out as a means to extract oil and natural gas from what had been before seen to be not economically viable. And there's still a question about their ultimate economic viability because of the costs involved. But that's really depends on what the price of oil is, to make it viable or not, or develop alternatives for energy, right? So do we want to increase our own domestic production, or do we want to look to alternatives and generation? So we think of in terms of both demand, like instead of having cars that require gasoline, why don't we have cars that produce other things like, or that require electrification, for example? Because if we also affect our generation of energy, like nuclear, hydro, solar, wind, to produce, renewable sources of producing electricity, and then the electricity becomes the source for powering our transportation, like electric vehicles, for example, then we've really become domestic, right? In the ways that I've talked about, particularly solar, wind, but also hydro and nuclear as well. That all happens generally locally. That all happens within the region. It's not something that can happen on a global market. So that's the question. And maybe the answer is we do a little bit of everything. And that's effectively what we've done in the United States. We have a history now where we've increased our own domestic production. We're now the largest. We've been for years now, the largest producer, bigger than Saudi Arabia, of oil. Fracking's been a big reason for that, but we've also opened up and incentivized the production. And that's not just for domestic, but because it's global, is to help assuage global prices, right? The global average price of oil. But at the same time, we've also done amazing things. And most recently, we've done things like the Inflation Reduction Act in 2022. I mean, that's been huge. Also the Infrastructure Act, but a number of laws that have been passed in the past few years, whether that's in relationship to dealing with the COVID pandemic, but also later to, essentially moving our domestic agenda in a direction where we're really incentivizing the electrification of our transportation system. So for automobiles, we've seen states like California and New York have passed laws that say that starting in 2035, no longer can you sell a brand new car that has an internal combustion engine. Effectively, they're creating policy objectives that are pushing the agenda, forcing companies and infrastructure, all of it, government forces, private forces, to really say, okay, we need to know that the majority of what we do starting at this date has to be different. We no longer can use internal combustion engines as the main mechanism. And that all helps. That's what policy does. So those are all policy statements. They're coming out at the state level. Like I said, California and New York are two examples, but also at the national level, and it's called the Inflation Reduction Act because we have inflation in the United States, as post-pandemic inflation, but it's one way to deal with that, but it's really not about it. It's really securing some of our social safety nets in the United States, and really pushing forward renewable energy, part of the agenda of the Biden administration at the time. So these are really important things because they are funding mechanisms that happen over a decadal sort of time frame, and they really will push domestic policy in new directions. But what we can see here is that we've done multiple things in the United States, and that's generally what we do, is we say, let's go ahead and increase our own capacity for hydrocarbons, oil, let's increase that. And at the same time, let's really push ourselves in a direction where we understand that we want to have new ways of developing, of generating energy, renewable ways, non-carbon intensive ways, and of transportation, of utilizing that energy for transportation, non-carbon intensive ways. And so there are other value considerations as well that we can say beyond sort of the historical aspects of what's influenced U.S. energy policy. And that includes consistency, stability, longevity, and environmental footprint. So these are all things that we're thinking about in terms of our energy needs. We understand it as fundamental. So we want to have consistency, right? We want to have stability. We want to have longevity. We want to have something that lasts for a long time. And we want to have something that there's an understanding of that, the environment being the outer limits, and where we can't really mess too much with the environmental outer limits. Otherwise, it'll have that sort of feedback that's negative for our societal and economic, well-being, which is really the fundamental of what a society is. In terms of controls on supply and consumption, vis-a-vis energy in the United States energy policy, some of the controls we have is, like I said, there's the OPEC oil embargo of the 1970s, and that spurred supply problems. And that resulted in consumption controls. so we did pass some federal laws like CAFE, the Corporate Average Fuel Economy. That's what CAFE stands for, that acronym. We passed CAFE standards, which then increased the average fuel economy standards. This is just like what I was saying California and New York and some other states are doing, which is to say, for example, no more internal combustion engine. I mean, that's really a significant move. That's saying no more using carbon as an input in our domestic transportation and our retail transportation, though. So individuals cannot buy cars with internal combustion as new cars in these states starting at this time. So that really is to push, the CAFE standards were to say we really need to have more fuel efficient cars. We didn't have the ability to move to electrification at that time, for example, but that was really not also, that wasn't about climate change in the 1970s either. That was about dealing with high cost of oil, aka gas. That gas availability and gas cost was going up. So let's go ahead and make things more efficient. And then we also, speed limits in the United States. We have on our federal highways, state as well, but on our federal highways, we have speed limits, federal speed limits. And people look at that and think, well, that's for safety. And in part it is, but it wasn't the original intent. The speed limits were really, that's how these cars at this time got the best fuel economy at that speed. So if they went faster than 55, it used to be 55 miles an hour. If they went faster than that, they would lose fuel economy. They would actually have less fuel economy. So that was one of the considerations for this dealing with the OPEC oil embargo and oil crisis with speed limits. And then car size, the weight of the cars also matters. So it's not just, CAFE standard is directly implied. If you have a lighter car and a smaller engine, then the same engine with a lighter car versus a heavy car is going to get better fuel economy with a lighter car. So that always that also played into it as well, and also helped move innovation in car and engine design around efficiency. So one of the things is what we can understand is when you have these requirements, these new federal laws like the CAFE standards, for example, that then pushes private industry. It gives them a goal, just like California and New York saying, we have to have, you better be moving on your electrification of your vehicles, developing, battery powered electric vehicles, and really get that development going. If you haven't already, most auto manufacturers, certainly US auto manufacturers, they're already well on their way in doing this. But, just anybody who wants to sell cars in the United States, any manufacturer, you really have to get up your game, get on your game of increasing your battery powered engines and making them the hallmark if you want to sell cars in the United States. In terms of policy responses to supply problems that help to advance environmental goals. So what's interesting is that part of the OPEC oil embargo, we can see it as just a cost, like an availability and a cost. The oil embargo meant that gasoline was going to be less available and more costly. And that created all of these sort of like reactions, but those reactions had real environmental benefits. And that's because we understand today that a lot of the problems we have in terms of air pollution, water pollution, carbon intensity, they all have to do with using those inputs, those basic inputs. So lessening the use of those inputs had environmental benefits. It wasn't that they were intended to achieve environmental goals, but they ended up having an effect on environmental goals. So new advances in consumption set the stage for technological advances today. What's interesting is we can see those sort of early pushes by corporate, by government policy to push automobile manufacturers to develop more efficient engines, to develop smaller, smaller sized, smaller weighted cars. You can see a lot of the fabrication today, a lot of the use of aluminum, for example, or the use of plastics and all kinds of sort of advanced forms of making the car much less in terms of its weight, but also incredibly safe, relatively speaking. So it doesn't have to be just sort of like that tank, with big heavy metal, in order to protect you. All these other advancements, they all derived from these things. The impetus for starting down this road really came from we need to have smaller cars, we need to have lighter cars because of something else. So we can see those as we can see seeds and how policy sort of begets, even if the policy isn't directed at your goal. So we're talking about environmental issues here, but they're not necessarily directed at environmental quality, but they end up innovating, providing incentives for innovation towards environmental quality. And so this regulatory structure of mixed incentives and goals, energy security and environmental protection, it continues to define energy policy in the US today. Again, remember, we're talking about large scale policy because there's just a litany of different types of laws, regulations, and this history is really the best way for us to understand how the United States operates and thinks about energy policy today. As a matter of final thoughts, to sort of wrap all of this up, now that we have a basic understanding of sort of a historical context, what do we mean when we talk about energy? How does the United States do energy? What is the goal? What are the overarching goals? And then what happens when that sort of energy, those goals of energy independence, right? Energy safety, what happens when they start colliding or mixing with environmental issues and questions of sustainability and the environment being the outer limit, precautionary approach? When we put all of these pieces together, what are we really talking about? The first thing we can say is there is no uniform federal law dealing with energy. There is no singular uniform federal law dealing with energy in the United States. And that's something we need to know and understand. There are diffuse policies from many agencies interacting from various positions and viewpoints. That's just the truth. It's kind of a hodgepodge. It's a mosaic. Remember NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act. It's our first major environmental law that we discussed in the course. NEPA applies. NEPA applies when you're developing, like I said, FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. When it's having a new plant go up, and it's the siting of the plant, the making sure that the plant, the power generation plant, what it looks like, all of the requirements. It's whether it's up to code, so to speak, et cetera, whether it's meeting all the requirements. NEPA applies at all of these stages because that's certainly a major federal action. When there's a new plant going up and it needs permitting by the federal regulatory authority, that's a major federal action, generally speaking. So NEPA would apply. So I want to say that the environmental issues or environmental considerations are always coming into these energy questions in the United States for no other reason than NEPA. There's certainly like I said, the Clean Air Act and many other examples, but NEPA is always involved. So there's no uniform federal law, but environmental considerations are always there, front and center. So for environmental concerns, generally secondary effects like sulfur, carbon emissions are the basis of controlling energy inputs. In other words, we don't necessarily say, now I know, like I said, there's New York and California, for example, are saying no more internal combustion engines of new cars being sold in those states starting in 2035. Okay, what they're effectively saying is from a policy standpoint, we are putting carbon and, as the forefront consideration climate change. We no longer want to have carbon as an input, and that has serious environmental implications. The understanding there is this is better for our social and economic well-being because we accept that the environment is the outer constraints, that in background environmental conditions should be what they've been. We shouldn't be unilaterally changing those because that change is creating disruptions in ways that are just serious, and they can run amok and get out of control and fundamentally alter our ability to have an Earth that is conducive for our well-being in the future. So that's really what it comes from. So environmental concerns, right? It's those secondary effects that are the basis, that are the push. The carbon intensity is the push, not just this would be better for the natural environment. And we just care about the natural environment, even if it's disconnected from our own individual well-being. That's not really what's happening. It is directly connected to human well-being through these secondary effects. And that's important to know. The US government offers many carrots today, right? Incentives, what I mean by carrots, right? To move energy policy towards non-carbon, renewable, and domestic sources like wind, solar, et cetera. And there's a lot of strong arguments for that. Again, environment, background conditions, but also national security interests. The idea of making sure that energy, and maybe we should identify energy as just a basic fundamental public good in the United States. It's absolutely necessary in an advanced economy in any country, really, but certainly in an advanced economy. And that therefore energy security, the ability to secure and ensure energy on a domestic level is fundamental. It's just a fundamental thing. So we need to have the means to do this. And therefore we need to incentivize. We need to incentivize all kinds of domestic productions of energy. And again, now falling back to the carbon problem is if we can produce that energy without adding carbon, without using carbon in that process, that makes a lot of sense because it ensures those background conditions aren't muddled with in a way that impacts our own well-being. The direct cost of renewable energy production has become very competitive with carbon-based sources. One of the other things that we need to know is that even on a direct apples to apples, forgetting about the indirect and non-use value costs, even though those are the basis upon which many of the policies are being developed, particularly carbon, the externalities caused by carbon, the emission of carbon. That is the reason. So that's an indirect. I wouldn't call that a direct. Although if we start putting in the cost of climate change into our models, I know insurance companies and reinsurance companies are now doing this, which is good. When they're setting premiums, they're importing in those costs, the climate risk assessments, into the cost of insurance, which is smart because it's real and it is a direct cost. But in many ways, we still see them as indirect and non-use values, so we push those off. But even on a direct cost basis now, certainly solar and wind, in most instances, solar for sure, is just cheaper. It's just cheaper. Even without considering any of the carbon, sulfur, et cetera, it's just cheaper than coal, for example, on a case-by-case, on a direct apples-to-apples comparison at the wholesale level, at the electricity generation, wholesale generation level. It's cheaper to produce because it's passive. It makes a lot of sense once you have it up and running. Once the technology has gotten to the point where it's safe, secure, and long-standing, and you've figured out how to make these things and make them reliable and make them resilient, they just sit there. They sit there and they take in energy and they produce energy, and they do it all the time passively. It's wonderful. So this will likely continue to influence energy policy in the future. The notion of independence, a lack of secondary effects, and direct cost competitiveness of renewables. So it's very likely, if we were to sort of have a crystal ball, all the things that are going on right now, it is very likely in the next 10, 20, 30 years that we're going to see, because again, they run hand in hand, as we have technological innovations, we're going to require energy production to support those technological innovations, right? And we can get more efficient with things, but generally speaking, more people, right? Productivity, et cetera, we're probably going to need more energy. And the energy, the bulk of that energy is probably going to come from renewables. And that sort of effect of technological advancement in renewables, making them even better, more efficient, more productive, more resilient, that process will make them even more cost competitive. And certainly the fact that they don't produce carbon as an output is just, an additional benefit, an additional reason. And we can see that that's probably going to be. So if we had a crystal ball, that's probably going to be something that is going to happen in the future. And that policy has already supporting that. We talked about the Inflation Reduction Act, some of the other major federal laws in the United States that are helping to incentivize, create a lot of those carrots, but will probably just happen regardless, even as market forces take over. So that's it. That's our sort of overview of energy. You have a sense of what energy is, a little bit of history of energy policy in the United States, why we do what we do, why some of that path dependence historically, how that affects our choices today, and also what we're doing and how we're thinking about energy in the larger context of environmental issues. So now we move on to our last sort of topic to discuss in environmental law, which is global. We start looking at environmental law from a global scale. So we step outside of the United States. That takes us past our energy, and we'll meet next for our last discussion of global environmental law issues. Thank you for your time.